Call our meeting.
Okay.
Hello, everyone. Welcome. I'm going to call the database management meeting on Tuesday, November 2nd, 2021 to order at 9:31 a.m. Deborah, do you mind doing roll call?
I would love to. Kate Hall.
Present.
Alex Todd.
Yep.
Joel Beverly.
Here.
Ariane Carey. Catherine.
Here.
Kayla.
Here.
Belinda. Not yet. Sarah.
Here.
Romy.
Present.
Anastasia.
Here.
Jessica.
Here.
And Richard.
Here.
And
Great.
then
Also
Deborah
present.
and Rebecca from CCS are here.
And Bob.
And Bob. Bob is here as well.
Very
Perfect.
exciting. All right, so next up we have approval of our August 3rd, 2021 minutes. Did anyone have any changes to the minutes? Nope, I'm seeing shaking heads no. Hearing that there are no changes, I'm going to declare the minutes approved by unanimous consent. Right? That was a shout out to Alex Todd, our resident parliamentarian. So we do have some fairly meaty items on the agenda today. So my hope is that our first agenda item seems pretty cut and dried. I'd like to reserve the majority of our time to talk about holdable settings for new materials and all the great data that Deborah has put together, and then end with, of course, sunsetting of Share Illinois and what we think about that in terms of what CCS might want to consider doing. So getting started with the extension of hold expiration dates, Deborah laid out very nicely in the packet. I think we're all very aware of the supply chain issues, as well as the publishers pushing back publication dates. And so we have kind of two questions before us. The first being, for new holds, do we want to extend the expiration dates, which I feel like is a pretty, low stakes thing to say yes to? And if so, what length of time do we want to extend it to? And then for existing holds, CCS, knowing that the problem is already happening, wants feedback on how long to extend existing hold dates to deal with the supply chain disruptions and publication delays. So why don't we start with the new holds piece? I'd like to propose that we look at 2 years. The reasoning being we should hopefully have things taken care of by then. We should also have, if things aren't taken care of, then it will give us that room to then extend further if we need to, and we won't have to go in and have staff do a ton of work. If things start speeding up, there's no harm because the holds will just be filled. So then we won't have them sitting there, but that should give us enough time to hopefully get us over this supply chain hump. Did anyone have any thoughts on that or feel that we should do a different amount of time? Okay, so if that sounds good to everyone, then I ask for a motion to change, to extend the holds expiration date for new items to 2 years from 1 year, and for us to revisit it at this time next year, so we can see if we need to make any further adjustments.
So moved, Alex.
Thanks, and can I have a second?
I'll second, Richard.
All right, thanks, Richard. Any discussion on the motion? All right, I know technically we're still doing the whole OMA meeting things, right? So we should do a roll call.
All right, I will do that. Kate Hall.
Yes.
Alex Todd. He was on the phone.
Yep.
Joel. Oh, thanks, Alex. Joel Beverly.
Yes.
Anne's not here. Catherine.
Yes.
Kayla.
Yes.
Linda is not here. Sarah.
Yes.
Romy.
Yes.
Anastasia.
Yes.
Jessica.
Yes.
And Richard.
Yes.
Motion passed.
Great. All right, so then the next thing isn't really a motion that we need. We just need some, CCS just needs feedback on existing holds. So these are the things that obviously are currently in the queue. Do we want to just stick and do a 2-year thing across the board? Or do we feel that we should do a different extension for the holds that are existing in the catalog?
So to clarify, right now, obviously, we have holds that are expiring on all different dates. So what CCS will do is add a certain time period onto the existing holds so that they're all staggered expiration periods. So we're asking how many additional days should we tag onto existing holds to extend out their expiration date and avoid them expiring during this period?
I think you had said, well, this was the recommendation for the new, but either do we want to just add 6 months or do we want to add, so that would be like 182.5 days. We'd probably round up to 183 and then 365 days added on if we want to add another year on to give ourselves some more breathing room. Thoughts from anyone? Yeah, Jessica.
Would it make it any less complicated, Deborah, for your team to just have a blanket 2 years, since Kate, as you mentioned, they'll just expire or they'll just be filled anyway?
We could just add on 2 additional years to the existing dates, or have them all expire 2 years from a certain date. Do you want them all? I guess that's my question. Do you want them all to expire on the same day, or just add on an additional X number of days?
I guess my question was just, does it make it any easier if we just pick the same thing for both of them? Like, I mean, again, they're all just going to be filled. So let's find the path of least resistance to get it done.
Sounds good. So we could, how many days are in 2 years? 700 and
731.
something. So if we add on 731 days to existing expiration dates for holds, we could have some holds that would expire essentially like 3 years from now instead of 2 years from now. We could absolutely do that. As you mentioned, if the materials become available, the holds will be filled. But we could then see some expiration dates that would be pushed back till 2024 for holds. I don't know if anyone sees an issue with that.
I think that what Jessica was suggesting, and I think I understand, Jessica, where you might be coming from, is if we set the hold time frame the same for both new and existing, would that be easier to implement? And for the new holds, that's being administered at the backend administration by CCS. That's a setting change. Whereas changing the existing holds, I believe, Deborah, correct me if I'm wrong, that we would be going to Innovative and saying, please change these for us, and it's a different setting. So I would say that we just add 1 year on, because some holds are expiring in a month and some are expiring in 12 months. So the maximum amount of time would be 2 years if we add on 365 days to the existing holds, which would put us right around the same time when we'd be reviewing stuff this time next year.
And that also would be now, as I understand it, just to reiterate, consistent with the new change of extending everything to 2 years for
Yes.
newly placed holds. Okay.
Yeah, essentially by doing, as Kate had suggested, 365 days, so just adding an additional 365 days, we would be saying no holds would expire in the next year. So we'd kind of be giving ourselves some wiggle room here to make sure nothing becomes expired as we're dealing with the supply chain issues.
Does that sound good to everyone? Okay, so then we will just direct CCS to extend the existing holds for an additional 365 days. Again, we will be revisiting that next year, the new and existing, to see where we are at. And I will just say that Ariane Carey has joined the meeting. So we can just mark for attendance. Welcome. Great.
Okay, I guess the only thing that I would say is maybe if we could come up with some consistent wording so staff could share with patrons who are like, my hold's been, I've had this hold for 2 years and I haven't gotten the book yet. What's going on? I mean, we get that already. You know, I've had the hold for a week and I still haven't gotten my book. But the longer the holds are in place, I think there could be some, and it could be just, hey, if you have a good saying, you know, share it with the group. But I think that's going to be something that patrons will notice and will want answers to. And I don't think they would understand this.
Yeah, but I think that we can I agree. And I think that maybe when CCS like shares this in their newsletter, saying something along the lines of something that you can encourage staff to say from a talking point perspective is, due to the supply chain issues and changing dates of many popular releases by publishers, we are extending due dates to ensure that you will be able to get your materials. This won't impact most of the items. We're doing this though to make sure that we don't have any issues with getting you the materials that you want, even if the publisher delays publication or there's a delay in shipment.
Yeah, but just, you know, shorter than that. But
That
I
was
trust
off the
CCS
top
to
of my
put that in
head.
the newsletter.
I'm like, right.
We'll put this in this Friday's newsletter. So we'll make sure Innovative will complete the work to extend existing holds an additional 365 days. This week before the newsletter comes out, we will change the expiration period for new holds today. That way, any new holds, and then we'll announce it in CCS News. And Alex, we'll do our best to have a nice, concise description of that. So if libraries want to, they could sort of copy and paste it into any patron communications.
And if anyone on this committee has already developed something that you've shared with staff, please send it to Deborah so that we don't have to recreate the wheel. Alex,
Thank
I'm
you.
looking at you.
Oh, okay. Thank you.
No, I'm just kidding. But if anyone has one, that would just make things a lot easier. Richard, were you going to say something or?
No, I was agreeing.
Okay, great. Okay. Then thank you guys for doing the hold expiration date thing quickly so that we have lots of time to talk about holdable settings for new materials. So just to remind everyone, because we don't meet monthly, so at our August meeting, we had a very robust discussion about what data we might need to look at in terms of determining whether we should have system-wide hold settings and how that might look. We had a bunch of questions which were included in the minutes that we had asked Deborah to look into. She put together a wonderful data packet for us that we're going to use to drill down to things, but she's going to start by kind of just giving us a high-level overview of what has been, what she's shared with us in our packet, and then we'll drill into each separate data set or, graph that has been shared and talk in a little bit more detail. The goal today is not to come to an understanding of what we want to do. The goal is just to dig into the data that we have, see what other questions, so that in February, we can continue this conversation and hopefully at that point get to a more shared understanding of a proposal that we might want to make.
Awesome. So
Deborah.
I'll jump in. Kate asked me to just review each of the charts and data points included in that handy packet I sent out. So I'm going to do just a very brief overview of all of those data pieces, so then we can jump into, again, our discussions and our questions. So I'm going to share my screen. Kate, can you see my first chart displayed here?
It looks fantastic.
Thank you. All right, so this first graph in the packet shows the number of libraries who have browsing collections or non-holdable collections. So before we kind of jump into this, I do just want to emphasize again, when you're looking at these charts, we're looking at a small set of our new materials. So CCS has been pulling since our last meeting daily holds data for some of the most popular titles that have been released since August 1. So we are looking specifically at titles that had, at the time the title was released, had over 50 holds system-wide. So currently right now in our data set, we have over 100 titles we're looking at. So again, these charts don't represent data from all of the titles, all of the new materials that have been released, just a set of the most popular ones. And by most popular, we mean those that had over 50 holds on release day, or what we call first available. And I sent out a list of all of the titles included in the data set to the group last week. So this first chart shows, like, of the titles in this data set, how many libraries had non-holdable or browsing collections or items for those titles. So it does look like most of our libraries, the majority, have hot collections or browsing collections or quick picks, whatever you might call them at your library. And the percentage of browsing or non-holdable collection varies by library. So some libraries have, about 45% of the items in this data set were non-holdable and belonged on their hotpicks collection. And then again, some libraries don't have any browsing collection at this time. But for the most part, most of our libraries have some sort of hotpicks collection. So at our last meeting, we talked a lot about, what is the purpose of new collections versus browsing collections, and do those fill the same need, or do those collections fill different needs of the library? So moving on to the next chart, this chart indicated, and we have sort of two versions of this. So this one showed the libraries that had almost all of their new items set to be holdable to all patrons. So we can see in this chart, we do have a handful of libraries that allow most or all of their new items. Again, we're looking at a small set of new items, but in this data set, we have a handful of libraries that have the practice of allowing all or most of their new items to fill holds for any patron versus limited to just their own patrons. The next chart shows the flip of that. So this chart shows, of the items in the data set, the libraries that have some sort of hold limitation on those items. So orange is going to be items that are holdable only to patrons of that library, while red will be items that are holdable to patrons of that library, but those libraries are using that days past first available setting to then open up holds at a certain time period to everyone. So you can see we have, most of our libraries have some sort of restriction on holds for new materials, limiting them to patrons of their libraries for at least a certain period of time. And again, I will note that at some point, I would assume that almost all libraries open up holds on these items to all patrons, but they're not taking advantage in orange of that setting that does it automatically. So Kate had noted at Northbrook, they manually flip items from being holdable to only their patrons to all patrons. The next chart here is going to give us an idea of which libraries are really sharing their new items out to fill holds of other patrons at other libraries. So this chart is going to show items in this data set by library that went to fill holds for patrons of other libraries. So again, once the library has worked through their own hold queue, if the item is holdable to everyone, those items then go out into like the CCS resource sharing stream, and they fill holds for patrons of other libraries. So this doesn't really come as a surprise. The libraries that allow their new items to be holdable to all patrons, they're the ones that are sending the most items out into the CCS stream to fill holds for patrons of other libraries. And again, we're looking at just a small data set. So when it comes to like all resource sharing, the numbers wouldn't match this exactly. So this is specifically for the new items in the titles we're looking at. Then this next chart is going to show sort of the breakdown by library of holds filled by the library's items versus holds filled by other libraries' items. So you can see like most holds are filled by items by the patron, owned by the patron's home library, with some variations here. So blue represents the patron's hold was filled by their library's item. Orange represents the patron's hold was filled by someone else's item. So the numbers vary library to library, but again, most holds are being filled by an item owned by the patron's library. And then this chart was really interesting. This one shows the holds ratio system-wide over time. So I was very impressed by this chart. We have a fabulous holds ratio system-wide for the titles we looked at. For the titles in the data set, again, this 100 or so titles, at launch date, the holds ratio was like approximately 2 to 1. This may vary by material type, by library, but system-wide, this was the number of copies to number of holds. We see, as expected, over time, the holds ratio decreases, hits about 1 to 1 around 30 days, and then dips below 1 after that. So, and we'll say that holds ratio. Ooh, can you guys see my screen?
Yeah.
Yes.
Weird. Okay. Just having some fun on my end. I will say that the math that's being done here is number of holdable items divided by number of holds. There are some variations we saw in the data where the holdable item wasn't actually available for circulation until a little bit later, which is somewhat misleading, but for the sake of this chart, again, we roughly have that 2 to 1 holds ratio at release day.
And then also helpful to note that is not, that it only includes the holdable items. It's not going to include those hot picks, lucky day,
That is
quick
correct.
pick.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Right. This is
That
not.
would totally skew things very differently.
That would, right. So this is not including, again, total items to hold. It is just looking at holdable items to hold. So it's only considering the items that are actually available to fill the hold versus everything. And then this last chart here, this was a question that came up at the last meeting, surrounding patron behavior. So how many of our total checkouts are coming from holds versus browsing? So we did find that for this time period, August 1 to October 15th, about 21% of total checkouts were the result of having placed a hold. So 79% of checkouts came from browsing. The patron walked in, had not previously placed a hold and checked out an item, versus again, this 21% is the patron had placed a hold first and came in to check out a hold.
Deborah,
So
thanks for
turn it
taking
back
us
to
through
you,
everything.
Kate, for questions and discussion.
Yeah, so does anyone have any general questions on what any of the charts represent before we start digging into individual ones and getting to some of the discussion questions? I want to make sure everyone understands the data that's being presented. So any clarifying questions on any of the data? Great. Oh, sorry, Arian, please go ahead.
Okay. I'm just
I didn't
always
pause long
curious as a, next door neighbor to Chicago, how the non-CCS library requests would skew any of these things. Just, we have such a vibrant Chicago population, and I, love it or hate it, they're welcome here, and they can take things out and place holds and pick things up. And obviously those libraries who are content with the arrangement as is aren't going to change anything. Is it that perhaps a library would behave differently, or are they behaving differently because of that perception of outside of CCS libraries that are?
I'm sorry, Erin, Catherine, do you mind muting yourself? I think that we're getting some feedback from other people there. Thanks. Sorry, Erin, please continue.
Yeah, no. That's something that always kind of is lurking in the back of my head. And, that it's its own basket it has a lot of wires connected to it, but I'm always just curious about other libraries' perceptions and if behaviors are people acting to shield theirs? Is it, I don't know, does that come into play at all? I'm just curious.
Anastasia, do you have any thoughts, as Park Ridge also shares? And I know for a long time had a very strict policy about Chicago card holders.
Well, we still have our strict
Okay.
policy, so yeah, I do think that's a valid point, though. I know when I worked at Eisenhower, that was a huge issue because on Cersei, the holds would fill in the number as they were placed, and they wouldn't give priorities. They wouldn't give priority to residents. I know we have a different system, but
Yeah, and I will say, so holds for non-CCS patrons, obviously, if a library has their items limited to just being holdable to their patrons, those items won't go to fill holds for Chicago or other reciprocal patrons. But those libraries that don't have any hold restrictions, those are the libraries whose items will go to fill holds of non-CCS patrons. Currently in Polaris, after we talked about this last time, that prefer my patron holds routing. So your library's items will go to fill your patrons holds first. And if you have no patrons left in the queue, you filled all of their holds, it will go in sequential order, in order of holds placed. So let's say a Northbrook item, it's holdable to everyone, it fills all the Northbrook holds. That Northbrook item would then go to fill the first hold in the holds queue, whether it is a Niles patron or a Chicago public patron. I believe when we were previously on Cersei, all of the non-CCS patron holds went to the bottom of the queue. We don't have that capability in Polaris. So again, the libraries who have their materials holdable to everyone, those are the libraries whose items would fill non-CCS patron holds.
Okay, I was not aware. I was assuming that it was the same kind of flow pattern, that it was your patrons first, CCS, and then reciprocal non-CCS patrons. So yeah, that's good to know. Thanks.
All right. Any other clarifying questions before we dive in? That's a little bit more than a. All right. So, oh, sorry, Joel, did you? I'm not pausing long enough, guys. I apologize.
Yeah, just clarifying that the whole priority tiers, there's just two tiers. The my own patron and then everybody else. There's not that third tier that separates CCS from everybody else.
That's correct.
Got it.
But we at an individual level, I might be totally misspeaking, can say, like, we're not, like, using Park Ridge as an example. Sorry, Anastasia. But like, they're saying, nope, Chicago people, you can't place any holds for us, for our items. But everyone else in CCS and other RBPs, we're cool. Anyone else in Rails, I think is how you guys had it set up. It's been like over a decade since I've worked there, so I don't remember, and it might have changed because things change after a decade. So is that accurate, Deborah?
I'm sorry, Kate, can you repeat the first part of that question?
So at an individual library level, you can make settings to make your collections non-holdable to certain libraries or like RBPs or
Polaris is a little bit complicated. So at the item level, you can determine whether an item is not holdable at all, holdable to everyone, or holdable only to your patrons. A library can decide that they don't want to allow reciprocal non-CCS patrons to pick up holds at all. So that would mean a non-CCS patron can't actually pick up a hold at your library. That doesn't mean, though, that your item, if it's holdable to anyone, can't fill a hold for pickup at a different library. So there are kind of two variations on that. Again, you can determine, are your items not holdable to everyone, or limited to just your patrons? And then two, you do or don't allow reciprocal patrons to pick up holds at your location. Most CCS libraries allow non-CCS patrons to pick up holds.
So, because it's looking at things versus the item versus the patron record, right? Is that kind of how it's divided out? So like using Park Ridge as an example, potentially they might say, Chicago people, you can't place a hold and pick it up at Park Ridge, but technically, because Niles perhaps allows it, they could place a hold and then it could be picked up at Niles.
Yep. Mhm.
Yeah, Romy.
So when you say the patron is placing a hold, they're calling the library and then the librarian or person on staff is placing a hold, or they don't have the ability to log in, right, and place a hold?
Not our non-CCS patrons, like a Skokie patron, or
Right.
they can log into the catalog as long as their card is registered at a CCS library. They're able to log into the catalog and place their own holds at a location that would not allow a non-CCS patron to pick up a hold. They'd be blocked from placing a hold, but they could choose a different CCS library to then pick up their items at.
I see, because we get around this through policy in that we as staff are not supposed to place holds for non-CCS people. So we can set aside a book for them informally when they call us, and then they can come and check it out. But we're not actually supposed to place a hold in Polaris for non-CCS patrons. But I didn't know that they had the ability to do that themselves.
Yeah, I can follow up with you on that outside the meeting, Romy, just to walk through Glenview specific policies regarding holds for non-CCS patrons, because I'll need to look at some of your specific settings. So I'll send you a follow-up email after this.
And then Catherine, and then I'm going to pull us back because I think we're straying a little bit from like talking about the reciprocal borrowers, which we could talk about, and I think is something that is still obviously has a lot of nuance and there's a lot of discussion around it. But so Catherine, go ahead and then we'll kind of shift us back.
Sure. I was just going to comment to Romy that we actually at some point changed our policy on that when we realized that non-CCS patrons could place their own holds. So it seemed to us kind of strangely obstructionist that we were saying no, but those who were savvy enough to know they could do it themselves were doing it anyway. So it was just for us more equitable.
We did the same thing a couple years ago because we were doing the same thing as Glenview was, and then we changed it. So, all right, so I'm gonna shift us back to talking about just CCS libraries and holdability, but I do think the RBP piece is something that we maybe need to figure out after the discussion if we need to get more data on that. I know we've looked at that in the past, and it's a fairly small number overall of holds. I don't remember the exact percentage. I want to say like 15 to 17% maybe. Like it was pretty low, but we can certainly revisit. So in terms of the first chart that you see on page 1 of the hold data overview, so you can see, as Deborah pointed out, that about just under 25% of new items are non-holdable, but there is, as you can see, a fairly wide range in terms of holdability with those new items. So for this, to start the discussion, Deborah kindly wrote out the discussion questions for us, so we don't even have to think of it ourselves, which is awesome. Should CCS set a limit on what percentage of new materials can be holdable, similar to what Pinnacle does? Also kind of paired with that, since most CCS libraries have browsing collections, does this reduce the need to restrict holds on new materials to local patrons only? So what are people's initial thoughts looking at this data on whether or not CCS should set a limit on what percentage of new materials can be non-holdable? Yeah, Jessica.
How would that be enforced?
I think at this time, if we were interested in pursuing something like the Pinnacle policy, it would be on the honor system. And then CCS would follow up as needed if there were any issues.
And running reports. I know Pinnacle, they run a lot of reports and they review them at they have monthly like governing board meetings because there's only 6 libraries, and they review those reports every single month to see whether or not people are complying. So, Ariane, you were going to say something as well, I believe.
Yeah, I think that, looking at kind of the inverse lines in some libraries, and of course it's like being in a Zoom meeting and only looking at yourself during these meetings. I'm looking at Niles and like guessing that the reason that we have the largest non-holdable hot collection is that we are open to lending out all of our new items. So we have built this kind of gate, or this kind of core of things that are hot picks. And also because we have all of our Chicago patrons, we need to keep a collection of items that is just for our cardholders. So I think we're using this as a tool. So I don't want to lose that tool.
And keeping in mind that this is 110 items, so it is a smaller data set. You might see it look very differently if we were looking at the whole collection. But yeah, that's an excellent point.
So for those libraries that do have hot copies or quick pick collection, is that intended to be like your browsing collection versus your new titles? It sounds like for Ariane, because you lend out, or your assumption is because you lend out all of your new stuff to anyone, you set this specific collections that your patrons have something to look at when they walk in.
That makes sense. Alex, yours is also pretty high in terms of non-holdable. Do you have any thoughts on this, on kind of your strategy at Prospect Heights?
Yeah, we're small, and so we want to get, we know we borrow a lot, but in order to do that, we know that we need to let ours go. And we're okay with that. We also have found that our patrons don't place a lot of holds. It's something that we're trying to get them to do. They come to us and ask them to do it. So, I don't know, we've had these discussions over many years about how much of your collection do you let others have and see. And, I've always been on the side of let our stuff go. And we haven't seen any downside to it. We haven't had any patrons coming up and going, why do I never see this Tom Clancy, Danielle Steele book on the shelf? And so it works for us, and we like doing it. It's simple. I like either all or nothing. I don't like segregating the collection into, well, these types of books are only for this long, and those types are the other thing. And that just creates more work and more headache for everybody involved. So yeah, it's the KISS method.
Well, and I think it also, the kind of way that what I'm assuming Prospect Heights and Niles are doing, it almost is the, we built the Polaris setting that automatically opens the holds, kind of, so to speak, but we're protecting it, that hold period, with the hot items because they're not holdable. So it's almost like before that functionality existed, we built in this protector for our, Lucky Day hot pick collection. So
I'm curious to hear from you, Catherine, because I noticed at Highland Park, you guys don't seem to have a very large hot pick, quick pick collection, but you also do restrict a lot of like your larger collection to Highland Park residents only, and have a smaller collection, or a smaller number that actually go out to everyone. So can you speak to kind of your practices there and how that has played out with patrons?
I think we have probably not reviewed this in quite a while. So I don't know that there's a high degree of intentionality here. One issue with our hot picks collection is we just have very little space for it. And because of the pandemic, we've eliminated our hot picks DVDs. And people seem fairly happy with that. So we haven't gone back to it. So I think that the hot picks actually has shrunk over the past couple of years. But we do keep our other new things from going out to other libraries, and we have only one renewal on them. I mean, our policies are really geared toward keeping those items on the shelf for browsing if they're not filling holds. But I noticed that, you know, when we get to the section on holds, it seemed like we were among the libraries that had the greatest percentage of holds. So I guess in some ways we've maybe trained our patrons to put things on hold rather than expect browsing copies to be on the shelf. So we sort of go in that direction as well. But I will say we are also a net borrower as a library. So that may also be a reason that we have so many holds, is that our patrons are getting things from elsewhere more in general.
Thank you. So kind of drilling into that next question, what are people's thoughts on, since we have so many libraries with browsing collections, does having those then negate the need, as we see in some of the other charts, to have stronger restrictions? And if not, why not? And if yes, what are some of the barriers that we might see being a problem to kind of shifting that? So like to put out kind of a hypothetical, say we allow up to 25% of your new materials can be non-holdable or holdable only to your patrons. I'm going to combine those two together for simplicity's sake right now. And then the rest of everything can go out and, you know, travel amongst libraries, and everything is available to all of the other libraries, which would include which would include RBPs, right? Do we feel that that would be a model that would serve our patrons? Would that be something, do we need more data on? Is that something that we think would just be a bad idea? And if so, why?
I guess maybe we need to kind of address like the bigger picture, like why, like let's revisit, why are we looking at this? Like what's the goal in reviewing this data? I think that would help me, because my Park Ridge perspective, you know, it's selfish, but if I have an 80% browsing collection, why would I want to send out more of my new material? I think another important thing we could look at is how long are people or libraries keeping their items new? Like I know at Park Ridge, it's 6 months, you know, but maybe other libraries are 3 months. So I'd be more comfortable with, you know, if you choose for 2 or 3 months to be non-holdable, but after that you have to open it up to other CCS libraries, you know, I think that'd be interesting to look at too, what practices other libraries do for how long they keep their items new.
So Anastasia, to kind of address the bigger picture question, I think you brought up some really good questions in that. The goal of looking at this is to determine if we can better serve our patrons by having a unified policy throughout CCS for how we treat new materials and holdability. I think that there's a question of, do we know, you know, we didn't have any data when we started talking about this last month. So now that we have this data, the question is, are our patrons being served? Are there things that we should change that would help? Is it in terms of not only filling patron holds, but as like Alex and I think maybe Romy mentioned, like people asking a lot of questions like, well, why isn't this available? And why is this taking so long? Or when will this be ready? Would it get things into people's hands more quickly But then in turn, I think we can't look at that in a bubble. We also have to say, but then does that detract from patrons being able to browse, right? There's these two kind of tensions that exist. And I don't think that we know the answer to that just yet. I mean, Deborah, would you add anything else?
Yeah, I'll go ahead and just jump in. So we initially started reviewing this because of the feedback we received during our patron user testing. So we talked a little bit about that at our last meeting. Because when there is not an item available, like if a patron is in the catalog and they want to place a hold on a new title, if there is no item that is holdable to them on that title, they will not be able to place the hold. So they'll receive a block or error message in the catalog and they won't be able to move forward with that hold. So when we did our user testing in 2019, we had some patrons give feedback that it was confusing. They didn't understand or they weren't able to determine which items could fill their hold. Was it one item on the record? Was it all of the items on the record? So that's why we initially started looking at this, is really from a patron experience standpoint. Are we providing the best service to all of our patrons? So I think that's where this discussion started. And then I think as you're looking at the data too, it also brings up some question of resource sharing. We're part of a consortia. When you look at some of the additional charts, like one of the questions I asked, is some libraries are sharing out their materials more freely. All patrons essentially would benefit from resource sharing, right? So every library has items traveling to their library from other CCS libraries to fill their holds. Do we want to have some standards in place to sort of contribute to the resource sharing pool, or do we want to let libraries just kind of keep doing their own thing? So that's from our perspective of why we're bringing this to this group.
Yeah,
Okay,
Joel, what are your thoughts?
I'm just kind of following all the logic here together. It sounds like there are two strategies to try to increase the liberation of new materials for holdability. Being the length of time or the specific collection. And I wanted to just kind of comment on Ariane's first point with the using the browsing collection as a tool to kind of keep items in for your patrons when there's a regional issue that's challenging their availability. And to set a percentage that all libraries should adhere to might be like a needless target of those libraries that are on the high end outliers of those percentages, where picking like 25% just seems an arbitrary number that seems to be the average as it is anyway. So it might be the system self-regulates okay, and let the regional libraries that need to use that tool keep it, but maybe play with a standardized length of time that new items come off that hold. Does that make sense to people?
Yeah, I think that there's also like 3 levels to this, which can get, well, there's more than 3 levels, but I'm seeing it as 3 levels right now because we're looking at items that are non-holdable, full stop, versus items that are holdable only to your patrons versus items that are holdable to everyone. So like using Prospect Heights as an example, they have a high number of items that are non-holdable, but then the rest of their stuff is basically like everyone have it, versus like, Fremont has very few non-holdable items, but the majority of your stuff is limited to holdable only for your patrons. So I think that there's also some play between all of those, like is non-holdable better, or is it better to have a small collection of non-holdable, but then everything else is for everyone else, which would still allow for the browsability? Or is it better to have everything holdable, but have a small percentage for only your patrons for a set amount of time, and then the rest be for everyone? Or is it a percentage of non-holdable, plus a small percentage of local holds only, plus a percentage of holdable to everyone, or, you know, there's like all of these different things. I keep seeing like a little matrix that you could slide the scale and it would adjust all of the other things. So we're not looking at a binary, right? We're looking at, I mean, maybe not even a tertiary. It might be, what would be like nine things.
Mosaic.
Mosaic, I love it. That's
Yeah, and
fantastic.
chime in just to supplement Kate, is that you're correct, right? Would we see sort of a waterfall effect from implementing one policy? So for example, if this group was to say, you know, we recommend all items holdable to all patrons, would then Northbrook turn around, and then pick on UK, you would never do this, but would Northbrook turn around and say like, well, guess what? We're making all of our stuff not holdable to anyone. So
Oh, wait, we used to do that with AV. Let's not go back and do that again.
So, you know, that's why, you know, we brought in, you know, do we need to have some effort to move towards a system-wide policy for holdable of new materials? Would we also need to implement some sort of system policy for, you know, the percentage of new materials that would be not holdable to sort of not that I think anyone's libraries would do this, but, you know, to kind of skirt any sort of system-wide policy. And I believe that's why Pinnacle has their policy in place. Like all things are holdable to everyone, and you do have sort of this limit on the number of items that can be not holdable.
And they
Sorry.
also have a limit, and then sorry, Ariane, I'll get right to you. They also have a limit on how many items you have to lend out, so that you have to buy enough copies of the new items. And if your, I think, outgoing or incoming hold fulfillment increases above 30%, that then it's showing that you're not purchasing what is needed. I don't think we saw any of an issue with that in any of our data presented, but that is something also to consider. Just because it isn't an issue now doesn't mean that down the road that might not be something that we need to look at. So Ariane, what were you going to say?
Okay, so it sounds like Pinnacle has this regulatory, it sounds like a nightmare, but I think what they're trying to do is apply levers to force everyone to be a little more equal. That being said, the original question is, why are we doing this? And Deborah's answer is that there was expressed discontent on usability during the last go round. Okay, so I think then what's missing from all of these data sets and kind of the idea that we might manipulate one and see on the matrix or on the mosaic how that would play out is where are the unsatisfied people? If we looked at these charts and we overlaid a rank of like a user ranking, like 20% of X libraries users are satisfied with the way holds works, we might then see that the dissatisfaction comes pretty consistently when the levers are set this way, and the satisfaction comes pretty consistently when the levers are set this way, because there's a whole range of how we've decided to tackle this, and we're all our own autonomous bodies, but we've agreed to work together. But we're talking about dissatisfaction, but where is that dissatisfaction? Because like that might be the linchpin.
Deborah, is there a way? I mean, I'm sure there's not, but I think the frustrating part is just that they can't place the hold, right? Because eventually a library will fill it. So I feel like that's probably the most frustrating part. So if there was a way that we could place the hold, so the patron knows eventually it'll get filled and they can still place the hold, I think that's probably the biggest part of that complaint. It might not be, well, I'm not getting it tomorrow, but I can't even place the hold, and I feel like I'm never going to be able to place the hold and get it.
I would add one piece onto that, Anastasia, because I feel like, at least at our library, and it sounds like at Prospect Heights too, it is, I can't place a hold, and also, well, how long is it going to take for me to get this? I've been on hold for a long time. And a long time to some people might be a day, and to others it might be a month. So that also is hard. Jessica, what were you going to say?
Can I speak from a tech services standpoint? Like at Wilmette, when we have an item that's on order, we leave it as only patrons from our library can place a hold on it because that affects our workflow. We're looking for the holds that are being placed by our patrons. And that really sets the workflow in our department. So I think that if, say, Wilmette is the only library that buys a copy of a certain book, and it can be, the hold can be for anyone, I think that then muddies possibly the holds report and just like our workflow. And so I'm trying to think of it in that sense and why we're making the decisions we are as a technical services department.
Jessica, can I just ask a clarifying point of how, if you were to allow that item to be holdable to anyone, how would it, can you just walk us through for like non-tech services staff, how that would change your workflow?
So when we put an item on order, so when we order an item, it is the hold is restricted only to Wilmette patrons. So that would be the instance if we own the only copy, that would be the instance where a patron sees a title but cannot place a hold on it because we are saying we need to go through and just look. We're essentially looking for our patrons' holds. So I don't know how, there would almost need to be like a revision to the holds report and kind of some thought on that, because I can't, without going one by one, I don't know how I see holds on items that only we have that are not our holds. So essentially we're in a way making it worse because the patron can then, maybe not making it worse, we're making it interesting because the patron could then place the hold, but then they're waiting on us to get it moving. And I don't know that anybody's looking for it.
And also, I would say this is what you're talking about is what we discussed when Palatine wanted a similar scenario to when Palatine wanted us to put in on order records for potential future things. And it was, well, how do we monitor that? And how do you know? Because it looks at your items on the reports we look at for buying multiple copies versus patrons placing the holds. So then the assumption then with our current workflow would be that, using Wilmette as the continued example, your staff would be saying like, oh, well, there's now 30 holds on this, only 5 are Wilmette, but do we have to satisfy our hold ratio because no one else has put this on order, only a couple other libraries? And so you would need to have essentially those 2 columns, but that could still result in some patron unhappiness because if the other libraries aren't looking at that, they won't know to order a copy. And that is an issue. And we at Northbrook look at the items on hold and we prioritize them in terms of cataloging and processing to get them out more quickly. So every day they're like grabbing stuff like this. This is how they're, yeah.
Jessica, where are you accessing the holds report? Because we use the one from client and it does seem to show how many of our patrons are on hold and how many copies that we own or have on order.
Yeah, there's a web report that you can run for your library specifically. We run it every Tuesday. In fact, it got delayed today. But no, it's okay. I'm just teasing you, Deborah. Yeah, so we run that every Tuesday and it lets us know all the items that Wilmette patrons have placed on hold. And so that's how we determine like our workflow for that day. We look for those items, we get them processed, we get them cataloged and out into our patrons' hands.
Okay, we run it from the reports in client because I guess we just didn't like the web report, which I think is a little bit more work to do, but.
It is, it's an Excel sheet and it's manipulating and that type of thing, but I'm happy to email you after the meeting and let you know kind of what we do.
Okay.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. Oh, sorry, go ahead,
Sorry,
Catherine.
I had another comment. We do get a lot of calls from people who cannot place holds on things because they are, I guess we have not placed the order yet, and they cannot place a hold on any of the other libraries on order copies that happen to have ordered it already. Just getting the call is kind of useful to find out that maybe we need to order something, but I don't think it's really reliable because probably a lot of people are just not bothering. But I will say we also do get calls from people who are confused because they see our items on the shelf and they cannot place holds. Or they're on hold, they're not getting our copy, and that's what they're upset about. Sometimes it's because it's a hot picks copy. Sometimes it is not hot picks copy, just a new item. So I think people do look and they see those items that are not circulating and they don't understand why they're still on hold when there's a copy on the shelf. So I do think that that is some of the confusion too, not just the on order items. And, you know, thinking this through, I think if we did expand our hot picks collection, and I'm not certain that that's what we would do if we made a policy change, but I think we would get more pressure from patrons to use basically workarounds to their placing holds because they don't like the uncertainty of seeing it on the shelf, but not knowing if it's going to be there when they get there.
So
And we do get a lot of people who
oh,
seem to like place holds as they're driving to the library, which I don't understand or encourage, but they do it.
yeah, no kidding. So Joel, I'm curious because I think that some of what Catherine is talking about speaks to, I think Fremont might have some really good insight into this because you guys don't really have not a non-holdable collection. There is stuff that's limited to yours. So do you guys have an issue with items being on the shelf and browsable, given that you don't really have stuff that's non-holdable for everyone?
Not that I'm super familiar with, not without like, you know, looking into like the data of that scenario. But as far as patron experience, it's not something that I've heard. Certainly not frequently.
So then I guess that begs the question of, is it better for us to go and have it be, instead of a non-holdable collection for everyone, have it be local holds only for some of these like hot pick ones until a certain amount of time and then open it up to everyone? Again, that's that like sliding scale of where it will kind of impact.
Yeah, I have a question for selectors. So we recently got a very timely ticket because it tied into this discussion. It was from Indian Trails, and they were expressing some frustration because, you know, patrons aren't able to place holds on certain upcoming titles if Indian Trails doesn't have a copy attached. So they were saying from a selector perspective, and I'm interested to get the take of the selectors in this group, that they would prefer to have the patron able to place the hold because then it shows up on their hold report, versus if they're blocked, the patron will always contact them to say they want this title to be purchased. So I'm interested from the selector standpoint, like, is that helpful to you to have patrons place the hold? And like, are you monitoring these reports that, for example, Jessica was mentioning?
So can we start with Romy? No offense to Ariane and Joe. I feel like there aren't as many holds typically placed on youth stuff, or at least that was my experience. So for better or for worse. So Romy, what is your experience at Glenview in terms of that?
Yeah, I wish I had my collection manager here with me, but I can definitely say that it does cause confusion, not just for patrons, but also for staff, if we don't know how in demand a book is. I can see that being a useful tool for selectors.
Yeah, Jessica.
I mean, I guess from a patron satisfaction mode, we really are missing people who want to place holds on something that their library so far hasn't purchased. So again, if we're going back to why are patrons unsatisfied, I mean, I guess I do feel like that's a huge hole.
Yeah. So Joel and Ariane, not to discount the youth services perspective, but do you guys have any thoughts?
Oh, I would just chime in that like looking at items that are on holds, even if it's not as numerous as it would be for adult services, like the new Diary of a Wimpy Kid book, that, you know, it does help to see that there is that holds demand to know how many multiple copies to order in items like that.
I think there are, like, you can slice this. If there's numerous holds, that's going to help you determine how many copies to purchase. But if there's the odd one-off hold and the person would have been frustrated had they not been able to place it, were you going to buy a copy just for one request, or would you have simply satisfied that need by getting it from your, brethren on the screen? Like, we're part of a consortium for that reason, so we don't necessarily have to buy every single book. And if it's a one-off, you've set the expectation that it's coming, and it is coming, but it's not necessarily that I'm going to buy that book. So two different kind of uses.
Yeah, Jessica.
So then to that end, in the one-off book specifically, like, could there be, Deborah, could there be a new report that's created that says that you, Wilmette, are the only one that has that copy, and there is a hold that's not a Wilmette patron? Because, I mean, at the same, like, again, like, Wilmette holds would have priority, but I have no way of knowing that there is a hold on something that is the one-off. And so I'm just doing that in the order that it comes. Would there be an expectation that as a secondary pass through the holds reports, you would look for any holds, especially on one-off items? Or, yeah.
We can absolutely modify any reports that are in web reports to have that be more clear. For example, titles that have holds of your patrons versus titles that have holds for other patrons. We don't currently have any guidelines or recommendation for, like, how to prioritize processing of materials. So if we were to, like, we could absolutely start working on that now, is creating some more robust reports, or at least doing, I believe that there are some SQL queries you can run in the client that help you identify in-process items with holds of your patrons versus holds of all patrons. So that's something we could do a little bit more CE on with libraries, and to create some more, like, clear guidelines for how to prioritize processing.
So I'm curious, I just want to pause because there's been a lot of ideas floated out. I think there's a lot of different things we have to consider with this. I just want to go around and see, on a scale of 1 to 10, where are you, with 1 being, I think we should just leave everything as is, to 10 being, we need to just toss out the system and start completely over and change everything. Where are you falling in terms of how much change you feel we might need to make to our hold practices in order to satisfy patron demand as well as patron confusion? So I'm going to just go around based on, or actually, it's probably easier to just have people type in the chat and I can read it out so we have it in the recording. So if you want to put just from 1 to 10, again, 1 being leave it all as is, to 10 being turn over the apple cart, set fire to it and start over, on where you think we need, where you're feeling for you and your library on where we need to be. So we're at 2.5 for Ariane, 2 for Anastasia, 3 from Joel, with a few small adjustments could help resolve some things. Alex is saying if the burning apple cart leads to consistent procedures across libraries, 10. If it'll still be a melange, then 1. So Alex, I'm going to put you as a 5. 5 for Jessica. Some sharing should be required for everyone. Romy's probably a 7. She hasn't thought through all the logistics, though. Yeah, there certainly would be a lot of logistics. Catherine is at 5 or 6. At the very least, a standard for how long items can have restricted holds would be useful for patrons. I'm going to totally just cheat and say ditto what Catherine said. So count me in that same ballpark as well. And Kayla said the same thing as well. So So it sounds like in general, we think a little bit of change is needed, possibly not changing everything, and maybe even to the point of changing a few things. So I feel like that is helpful to kind of see where we are all at. We're definitely not at a place where we're all like, yes, this is the direction we need to go, which I think is really helpful. So I want to dip a little bit further down into some of the other discussion items so we can keep digging into this. And then I want to give us enough time to think about what questions do we still need to have information for to prepare for the February meeting, and what other things do we need to either ourselves investigate, have CCS staff put together reports for. So I'm going to try and leave about 10 more minutes for discussion and then another 10 minutes to talk about next steps and further discussion. So one of the questions that Deborah asked in here, which I think is a really excellent one, is all CCS libraries benefit from intra-CCS sharing of new materials, but not all libraries are placing new items into the intra-CCS stream. So we've been really focusing on patron confusion, I think, up until this point. So from a resource sharing lens, does this matter? So I think that this gets into the philosophy of where we need to be as a consortium, as libraries, as resource sharing entities in the state. And I think that this also ties into how are we meeting our patrons' needs? So what thoughts do people have on where this falls, either as you as an individual librarian, you as a representative of your library, or you as a member of CCS? Because I think that there's a lot of different lenses that we can look at this from. Oh, Ariane, great question. She asked, can we overlay satisfaction rankings over all of these graphs? Talk a little bit more about kind of where your like satisfaction rankings from patrons, or
Yeah, I mean, if our goal is to best serve patrons, if they have a need, our goal is to satisfy their information needs, and then we in-house figure out how to do that best through our processes and staffing models. If there is dissatisfaction, and again, the levers are set in a specific way, maybe that points to, as Joel said, a set number. And then maybe you can explore like a high satisfaction ranking with, kind of pull those low satisfaction rankings towards the higher ones. But again, all of these user groups are different. In Niles, we're kind of late adapters of technology. Our holds are probably more likely to come from face-to-face interactions. We do have super users who are using it, but I think that's a smaller percentage. So is our Wilmets and are some of these communities high users of the website and placing the holds themselves? So there's so many, this mosaic is very rich. The tapestry is rich. And if we pull a string here, is it going to affect a string over here?
yes, because everything is a butterfly in an ILS, right? But I think those are great questions.
And
What other?
CCS can work. We can talk internally about the feasibility of doing some additional patron feedback gathering, and see if we can maybe gather some data specifically on patron behavior, how often they're encountering errors within the catalog. I'm not sure if that's data we can grab, but I will do some digging to prep for our next meeting to see what additional patron info we can get.
And I think also it would be helpful, kind of speaking to the super user perspective, could we look at what percentage of our overall patrons are placing holds? And of that, what percentage of those are like super hold people? Like we all know the patron that will place like 50 holds every week. and then take the music CDs and burn them. No, they would never do that. And so like that, I think also is understanding, are we looking to get to 100% patron satisfaction on all holds everywhere? Or are we satisfied with having 90% satisfaction and people feeling like they get their holds in a timely manner? And we know that 5% of the people placing holds are like, well, I'm not that happy, but maybe their expectations are not reasonable.
We're not gonna be able to satisfy all the people all of the time. And that's Lincoln. So you do the best that we can with system that works best for our staff and the majority of the folks. The super users and the once a year users, or if they're going to be unhappy, but for different reasons. So you can't satisfy them. You come up with a broadly simple plan that's easy to explain and go with that.
Jessica, what were you thinking?
One more thing I just wanted to mention, and I don't know how much this affects anything, but Wilmette, when you land on our pack, it is limited to Wilmette items only. And so I'm just wondering, what's the breakdown of libraries that say CCS libraries, and what's the breakdown that says just my library items?
I would have to look at that. After our user testing in 2019, we did recommend that libraries open up their limit to show materials from all CCS libraries. However, due to COVID, when we paused resource sharing, I know that many libraries reverted back to limiting the catalog to just their items. I don't know how many reopened it back to defaulting to search all member libraries. So I can look at that for the next meeting.
So getting back, and I think we're giving Deborah a lot of work to do, which is, I'm sure, just thrilling for her and for Bob, who I know is going to get to run a lot of these things. But philosophically, where are people sitting in terms of should we be trying to open things up more from a resource sharing perspective? Or is that something that we feel isn't necessary to do?
I can speak for Park Ridge. I think for us, our new collection is our browsing collection. So like how Niles views their hot picks as their browsing collection, that's how we view our new collection. So I think the concern would be, well, if they're going to other libraries to fill holds, I think it's great. We'd be sending things to other libraries, but if people are coming into the building and they're not seeing it on the shelf, they're not going to know. They're not going to know it's available. So I think for us, that's the biggest hurdle. And, I think it's great that like Niles and Prospect Heights do share their new collections. I don't know if it's fair to expect everyone to do that because that was a choice, so that's just kind of how I feel about it.
Well, like I just to chip in on that, if I could, that it would also, the burden would be shared by everybody that also is like loosening their restrictions. So it wouldn't be like as drastic, I think, if this were across the board kind of thing.
I think to that point, Joel, I love the graphic of the holds ratio over time. I think that's a beautiful line dropping. I'm curious what that comparison was before. Remember, we wouldn't push a hold onto the greater collection until X amount of, I think it was weeks. And then once there was some trepidation about opening that up. And as it turned out, we dramatically shrank wait times across the whole consortium. And there was a negligible sense of loss across the buildings because, to Joel's point, it was spread out over 20 something libraries. And now we're gaining library. We're in a feast period with new buildings and new collections. So I think that it would be curious to see what this looked like before that action and post. And also just to kind of think back, it didn't really hurt. But I know a lot of people were bracing for that to feel lousy and for their shelves to be empty. And that was not the case. And user satisfaction went up tremendously. So, you know, not to say that just do it, but it's good to share, and it doesn't hurt as bad as you think. But with it, we can articulate that in with data as well. So maybe.
If I could say something from Huntley's experience, we used to
Please.
share everything right away. And patrons wondered why, well, not everything, but most things, because we sent out our new books. Patrons wondered why we had so few items on our shelves, and tech services was checking things in and they were going right out to other libraries. So we implemented the 30-day restriction. So we're still sharing things when they're new, but our patrons are seeing them first, and we're very happy with it. And it was easy, it automatically happens. We don't have to manually change anything. So I don't know if enough libraries know about that. It's a good idea.
Yeah, well, and it looks like a fair number, right? Like 35% or so, it looked like are using that, Deborah?
A smaller number than, I think 4 only are using the
Oh, I
automated
guess it is
setting.
smaller, yeah.
To flip, just from hearing this discussion, from a CCS perspective, it seems like that would be a logical first step if we wanted to have a system-wide policy, is to require libraries to use that setting, and then determine a standard period in which you would open up holds to everyone. That seems to me like it'd be sort of a win-win in many scenarios. It would allow patrons to be able to place holds on everything, but allow libraries, if they choose, to also restrict holds to local patrons temporarily. Because I do hear, that you want new items available for your patrons for a period of time. So I think that sounds like a more reasonable ask for libraries to implement than saying everything's holdable to everyone. So I think that could be potentially a good first step towards some standardization. I am curious, Kate, you've been asking a lot of questions, so I'm going to flip it on to you and to Alex from a director standpoint. So you asked, like, conceptually regarding resource sharing. You are 2 libraries who have sort of opposite policies for sharing of new materials. How do you both feel about sort of this, again, this overall resource sharing perspective, with some libraries sharing new stuff and some libraries not?
Alex, do you want to go first? Do you want me to go first?
Oh, I'll go first. So I think I would love to have as broadly accessible collections for everybody as possible. With, again, I think our limitation is our hot picks, and we keep that in, and that's, first come, first serve. We call it the lottery collection. If you find the book, you win. But the rest of the stuff, we send it out. We do on occasion. I don't think we have any delayed like Huntley has. But we also, again, we haven't had too many issues of books not hitting the shelf, at least at first. I like opening it up and having it that way.
I feel like Illinois is unique. Well, not unique. I feel like one of our core values as public libraries and all types of libraries in the state is resource sharing. I have long wished for more uniformity in how we deploy things. Right now, Northbrook has more restricted policies. We're doing a lot of things manually, which is not my preference. And we're trying to be equitable while making sure that we have enough copies on our shelves for browsing. And so I would love to have uniformity across this, especially if it meant greater resource sharing, reduced wait times, easier access for our patrons and for all patrons, because I think that helps all of us, right? But right now, things are so split that you have people that are sharing everything and then people that are sharing nothing. And so it makes it very hard for me to be like, well, let's share everything, because I know we're already just barely, but we're a net lender, right? We're like 55-45. So I know if we opened it up though, we would be sending way more out, but I would feel very happy if everyone was sending stuff out, because I knew it wouldn't increase, kind of like what Ariane was talking to. And that would speak to one of what I feel is a core library value of resource sharing. And one of the concerns that I think people often express is, well, but then if the library doesn't have to purchase enough items to satisfy their own hold needs, then it isn't speaking to the issues of making sure those libraries are appropriately funded and relying on libraries that are appropriately funded to satisfy those demands. But I feel like the data that Deborah presented to us today shows that at least right now within CCS, we don't have that issue. There isn't, in Prairie Cat, there used to be a huge disparity, right? Because you had libraries like my library that had a budget of $2 million, all the way down to libraries with operating budgets of $50,000. So of course there's going to be major disparity, even though we have a wide range of budgets and resources in CCS, we are purchasing appropriately to meet our community demand, which I think makes it easier to make a more broad change for things. So that's where I stand. Hopefully that was helpful, Deborah. So I want to just recap where I think we're at in terms of data we need and information we need to gather to talk about this more in February. So one, we want to look at how many libraries have it set up in the pack to only search for their library's items, right? I think that was from Catherine. We want to look at the total percentage of patrons by library that place holds, and then what percentage of those are super users. I totally acknowledge that we're not defining what a super user is, and I feel like we can't do that until we see the total percentage and see the number of holds being placed, and we could apply a metric across that. And then I also feel that we also still don't have a good sense of do people, what's on shelf at any given moment out of the new items, and is it enough to satisfy demand, because we know that 80% of items are checked out through browsing. I feel like we started inching towards it, but I don't think we have a good clear picture, and that came up a lot, several times in today's conversation. So what other pieces of data do we need to look at, either asking CCS to run or having ourselves do some work on kind of finding out stuff from our libraries?
Just like I don't mean my question about overlaying satisfaction with these grids to mean that I want a user study enacted and everything. If it's possible to pull those comments from the 2019 user study, that's great. And if it's digging in, I don't need to add to anyone else's burden, because mine is mighty myself. But maybe that would be a great report, a canned report. Kate's idea of like, here's a snapshot, what's on the shelf. You know, Angie's List, when they were a magazine, they used to send out like, here's a shopping list of 25 items. We went to this store, this store, this store, this store, and purchased these exact same items. And this was how much each cart cost at each place. And just out of curiosity, like if a user walks in, using the same maybe standards that you built these graphs with, that might be an interesting thing to see over time. But maybe I'm making more work for you. I don't know.
We're definitely making more work across the board for Deborah and Bob.
This is helpful work. This is good stuff. We want to make sure you have the info you need to help us come up with a recommendation if we think we should move forward with one. So I like the idea of a snapshot of what's on the shelf. I may need to reach out to this group though to determine how you identify your new collections, maybe get some info from you on shelf location, material type, call numbers. So don't be surprised if I send out a call for some info to this group in a couple weeks.
And would it also be helpful, like you did with this data, to look at a subset, say like New York Times bestsellers for this period, and then you could look at it over like a couple months to say like, oh, okay, this is how it kind of changes, and seeing things. Not sure.
Yeah, we do actually have data from this set of when items are available on the shelf. Do we think it would be helpful to look at just these titles, or do we think it would be more helpful to look at sort of all of the stuff in your new and browsing collections?
I think starting with a subset, right? Because what people want is they don't just want to see a wall of titles. They want it to be titles they're interested in. So that means titles they're hearing about in the news, titles they're seeing on lists. And so I think, yes, the broad spectrum would be interesting, but I also think that people's perceptions might be like, well, I didn't see any new stuff. Well, they mean new stuff that they consider popular, I guess. I don't know. I might be making a lot of assumptions there. I probably am.
Well, if we could focus on maybe, don't we all have a carousel? Isn't this a don't we have a bib record set of New York Times? I mean, something that already exists to plug and chug is, I think, it exists. We can use it. Is that problematic?
I think we could figure something like that out. Bob's here. I'll put my head together with Bob to see what we can put together for you. Again, we already have this data for this specific set of titles. How many copies are available on the shelf at like each day? So we can work to map that, and then we can sort of create a complementary report too with either all of your new titles, all of your browsing collections, or something like the New York Times bestsellers, which would be some things that have been kind of in circulation for a longer period of time, right? Stuff stays on that list for multiple weeks. So I'll put my head together, Bob, and we'll see what we can come up with.
Okay, that sounds great. What other data do we think it would be helpful to grab for the discussion in February? Catherine, yeah.
I'm sure that this data exists and I just don't know where to find it, but a question I can imagine being asked in my library is how long the average item is in transit when it comes from another library. Like how long does it take from, ship to awaiting pickup? And a different angle to think about, and this is just sort of a small matter, but I've noticed recently, we have some items, that we have a patron on hold for. We rush it through, technical services. We get it checked in, and we no longer have a hold because it's the release date. Another library has already checked it in, and now there's an item on its way from another library to fill our patron's hold. So they have to wait an additional couple of days. Meanwhile, we have a copy sitting on the shelf. I don't think that this happens all the time. It's just those rare cases where there's a handful of holds across CCS, and our patron happens to be one of them. But I think something to think about, saying it doesn't sound like maybe we're headed in this direction, but if we did open it up like everything is holdable by everybody, maybe there should be a restriction of at least 1 day because of that release date when we're all checking in the same items. Somebody has to be first. And it is just more efficient to fill your own holds if you have them. But I do think philosophically, if our library is thinking about, how resource sharing in general, I think people will want to know, is this making our patrons wait longer versus having the item right there on the shelf?
I think that is a good set of data. And I know we looked at that when we were looking at the first changes we made a few years ago. So I know Deborah had put together, I can't remember the specific details, Rebecca had put together stuff probably with Deborah on how that number, and we were looking at it unilaterally, not in like a specific subset of like brand new items. But that might be something we could pull to look at from like then versus now.
I'll also investigate Polaris settings to see if there are any changes we could make to optimize trapping of materials. At this time, I don't know if there are any settings we could change without removing prefer my patron, which I think I don't think anyone would want to do that. So I will do kind of a deeper dive into routing of materials to see if we have any options or flexibility.
And I don't know if this is possible, but kind of tacking on to what Catherine was saying. I know we've been down staff, and so for a while, our pick list was taking a lot longer to fill and to grab items from, and we're in a better place now. But I would be curious, I think it isn't just how long it is once it's marked in transit, but also looking at how long items are on the pick list, because it's the time from hold place to hold filled and checked out, and kind of how long is an item not available for browsing almost, right? Which would mean, and also how long does it take for someone to get an item? I guess those are two different things. Because I think that is a concern people have of like, well, if we open stuff up, how will this impact the stuff we have and what percentage will be impacted? So, and then Deborah, I feel like another thing that isn't data so much is kind of having us look at using that, that kind of lever piece between non-holdable local holds and holding for everyone. How could all of those interplay, and maybe having us, and we could maybe talk offline of like, what are some different scenarios that this might look at? If we change one, what are the ramifications and how does that play out? And is there a way to look at the potential impact, or is it something that we have to take up more a design thinking where we're changing something and doing a more iterative process where we try something and then kind of see how it goes and then tweak? I don't know if anyone else has thoughts on like because I'm just struggling like in my head getting a visual of how everything interplays with each other.
Yeah, and we can talk offline and we'll talk more internally at CCS. This is tricky, changing settings. I do not think there are any ways really to test implications without doing it. So we can talk about, if we are to make any changes, what would we need to monitor, track, like if we are going to have sort of a trial run for some sort of policy change. So we can put our heads together at CCS to see, what a good path forward would be for that sort of testing.
Great. All right, well, I think that we've given, thank you. That sounds fantastic. I think we've given CCS staff plenty of work to do. I know that the only thing is living for the fun stuff that database management comes up with having them do. So
the stuff is so fun. We don't get to do this kind of thing often. So I thank you all for your feedback. This is wonderful. We've got, I think, a lot to work with.
So we're going to move on to our last discussion item, but if you do think of other things or things we need to consider, please don't hesitate to reach out to Deborah or to me, and I can talk with Deborah about it. Other things you think we should consider when we meet for our February meeting. So the last item is talking about the sunsetting of Share Illinois. So just as a reminder, Share Illinois is currently, oh, someone left. I don't know who it was. Oh, it was Bob. Share Illinois is something that has been in operation, I don't know how long, but Rails is now sunsetting it as of 3 days ago. And so the question is, do we want to continue doing this? We're not deciding. Executive committee is going to be talking about it. So we're more looking for what feedback can we give them in terms of whether or not this is something that would be good for CCS to do. And this allows us to go into other catalogs and place holds from other LSAPs rather than going through OCLC. And it also allows those other consortia to do the same for us, as well as some standalone libraries. So Share Illinois will be no mas, is no mas as of this moment. So anything that we would do would be more free form, us setting stuff up ourselves. There isn't like going to be as much of a structure around it. The ILL committee did think that it would be good to continue that. We don't have to have the same opinion. We can have the same opinion. This is more just giving Deborah some feedback that can be synthesized and shared with the executive committee so that they hear from a wide range of people. So Alex and I are going to be mostly silent so that we can hear from the people that are actually working. I know we don't have any really ILL people here, but we have CERC people and tech people and reference people. So Deborah, I don't know, I maybe summarized it too quickly. Is there anything else that you would want to add before we kind of see what people's thoughts are?
I will just add, so again, as Kate mentioned, this was a Rails sponsored program to just allow for better and quicker and easier resource sharing between consortia. Both Swan and Pinnacle have determined that they will stop allowing libraries to directly place holds in the catalog. RSA and PureCat have said that they will keep allowing this practice of libraries, again, log directly into their catalog, place the holds. So CCS is just looking for some feedback on what do you guys think? It's discontinued by Rails. It's not an official thing anymore. Should we continue in some sort of informal fashion to allow libraries to do what they've been doing for the past few years? Or is this the time to like, Rails stopped it, it's a good time for us to stop it and discontinue the practice. So Anastasia, I think you're our lone CERC person in here. So if you want to get us maybe rolling by sharing your gut feelings.
Perhaps she had to step away. And I'll add just one thing to consider with this, which is over a 2.5-year period, we had about 1,500 items placed on hold from other libraries. Deborah said that the number of CCS libraries placing holds in other catalogs is minimal. So that's what we're looking at. So until Anastasia comes back, does anyone have any other thoughts? Well, not other. Does anyone have any thoughts on yay or nay moving forward with having CCS continue to offer this or not? Oh, Anastasia is back. Great. So Anastasia, I don't know if you heard any of the stuff. What are your initial thoughts on whether or not CCS should continue or not with Share Illinois?
I think if the ILL group recommended it, I'm okay with continuing it.
And so to clarify, if we discontinue it, that would mean we shut down our ILL for CCS branch. Right now, libraries log into a very specific PowerPack branch to place holds. So discontinuing it would mean we just remove or close that branch. And then libraries would either have to place ILL requests through OCLC, or in the event of a library like Naperville, who is not an OCLC member, they would just need to place direct requests with the individual library instead of placing the hold themselves.
And Naperville was our second highest with 179 holds placed over a 2.5-year period, which is still pretty minimal. Does anyone have any thoughts on this? Are people ambivalent? Does it not really impact you, so you don't have any thoughts? Are you tired because of all of the holdability talk? And now you're like, I'm done.
Hey, is my mic on? This is Rebecca.
It is on.
I can hear you.
Oh, right. Sorry, I just hopped back in. I did just want to update. So most of the libraries that use Share, according to the stats Deborah pulled, are Prairie Cat libraries. And I did confirm with Carolyn just this morning, all of the Prairie Cat members are OCLC members. So if we did like turn off the system, they could still access all CCS materials through OCLC. And per Carolyn, most of their libraries do place their holds that way. There are just a handful, as you can see on the sheet, that find it easier to go through PowerPack. So, I mean, from a simplicity and ease perspective, like I feel like discontinuing it makes sense. because we have OCLC and, you know, so many libraries are paying for it. But, you know, I'm not an interlibrary loan staff member. I'm not the one doing the work. And, you know, if people are happy to maintain it, that's fine with me. So I just wanted to share that about Prairie Cat, since that was kind of my outstanding question that I just got an answer to. So thank
Thanks,
you.
Rebecca. That's helpful. So does anyone have any thoughts? Yeah,
Right
Joel.
before Rebecca spoke up, I was gonna say, I kind of feel like I am ambivalent on the continue, discontinue of it. But it does seem like OCLC is another wheel that's there that a lot of libraries use. And I know before I was at Fremont, I did work at Wakanda Library before they were in CCS, and they used OCLC for interlibrary loan as their standard. And if it's available for lots of libraries to use, if they're relying on share, then they'll probably just go to OCLC, and you know, the same type of services there is what the perspective I'm seeing.
Thanks, Joel. That's helpful. Any other thoughts?
I spoke with our ILL person about it. She was in favor of it, she just thought it was another option for libraries. And she said that we did use it before we were in CCS. So I don't know, maybe sort of felt like paying it forward for other libraries as a way to share. But I don't know that from the technical services standpoint, I mean, it doesn't really affect us, so I don't have any strong feelings about it. It's really, you know, just one person who would use it here.
And I know we don't use it at Northbrook. Yeah, and Alex is shaking his head as well. Any other thoughts? All right, so I would say from a feedback for executive committee standpoint, people seem pretty ambivalent, and it's like, maybe there might be a few people that would find it helpful. I think it's not from a necessity standpoint, it's more from just like yeah, this is nice, but it doesn't seem like this is a critical core service for us to provide for other libraries or something that we are using actively to place holds in other LSAPs. Is that a fair summary? Okay, so hopefully Deborah and Rebecca, that gives you guys enough info to take to exec committee.
I think we're good.
Hey, look at that. That was like quicker than I thought that was going to be. So, and based on our agenda, we are at the end. Is there anything else that anyone has that we have not addressed before we adjourn? All right, well, thank you guys all for the very rich discussion today. And I hope everyone has a wonderful end of their 2021. We'll see everyone back in February with more fun data and graphs to look at. And yeah, so have a wonderful rest of your year, everyone. I'm going to declare the meeting adjourned at 11:19 a.m.
Thank you all.
Everybody, see you in February.
Yeah.